So we all remember Mark Antony from Julius Caesar, right? Whipped up the citizens of Rome into a full-on rebellion, led an army against Brutus and Cassius. Truly a victory for the forces of justice. That guy? Yeah, pretty swell dude overall. But he's actually better known for a different Shakespeare play that I referenced a few times in that video, a sequel of sorts by the name of Antony and Cleopatra. So our story begins with two nosy soldiers explaining to us that Mark Antony used to be so cool before he got a girlfriend, at which point enter Antony and Cleopatra being completely adorable at each other. Now Antony's part of this thing called the triumvirate, a group of 3 people ruling Rome together in the wake of Caesar's death. The other 2 guys involved are Caesar Octavius and this guy named Lepidus. Unfortunately, Antony's a touch distracted these days and has been somewhat lax in his triumvirate duties on account of the fact that he's currently dating her. I mean, are we blaming him? A messenger arrives from Rome, but Antony's too busy gazing into Cleopatra's eyes to listen, which turns out to be a bad thing, because it turns out the news was that his wife Fulvia and his brother Lucius had staged a rebellion against Octavius and summarily lost, and also Fulvia's dead. The messenger throws some minor shade in the direction that maybe this wouldn't have happened if Antony were actually seeing to his duties in Rome, and Antony's mildly bummed, but not super broken up about it, because, lest we forget, he's dating her. Oh, and it wouldn't be a Shakespeare play without some hot soothsayery action, so we get some sweet foreshadowing in the form of Cleopatra's servants being told that they'll both outlive their queen and that the best days of their lives are behind them. Also, there's this guy Anabarbus, who's Antony's servant, and oh my god, he had hair? So Antony's come to the conclusion that being with Cleopatra is making him soft, obvious joke, and he has to break things off and return to Rome, because among other things there are pirates in this play, and that needs dealing with or something. So Cleopatra feigns a fainting spell and tries to get Antony to stay in Egypt, but Antony's like, look, I love you, but there are pirates, man, and leaves. Although before he does, Cleopatra mentions how not broken up he appears to be about the straight-up death of his wife, and wonders if he'll be that chill when she dies too. Spoiler warning, no he won't. One thing before I continue, Cleopatra is a very manipulative character. She does everything with extreme levels of theater and keeps pretty much every interaction on her own terms. Even though Antony's fundamentally going against her wishes by leaving, she's still pretty solidly in control of the situation, having confirmed that he'll come back to her when he's done. Also noteworthy is that the Romans, except for Antony, don't see this right up until the very end. The soldiers, Octavius, and most other Roman characters in this play characterize her as a shiny exotic toy, keeping Antony distracted and weakening him as a soldier, but Shakespeare wrote a really solid character when he wrote Cleopatra. She's proud and self-assured, and makes her own decisions a lot of the time, and they're not always good ones, but she's the one making them. It's worth keeping an eye on her exact influence in the play, and noting those few points where she loses control of the situation, and how she responds to that. Anyway, back to the story. Octavius and Lepidus are discussing the pirate problem, as well as how Antony is utterly failing to honor the code of bros before hoes. Lepidus is of the opinion that they should let him have some fun, but Octavius is much saltier about the whole situation. Back at Cleopatra's palace, a messenger from Antony arrives carrying a pearl that he says Antony kissed, then ordered him to deliver to Cleopatra. She asks him if he looked happy or sad when he left, and upon hearing that it was more of a stoic, unreadable kind of situation, she's quite pleased. See, if he were sad, it would be detrimental to his soldiers, but if he were happy, well, that'd mean he liked being away from her, which would be equally bad. So Antony meets with Octavius, who's pretty salty with him at spending so much time in Egypt, but they decide to put aside their differences and focus on kicking pirate ass together instead. But to make sure they keep this whole blood brothers thing going, Octavius suggests that Antony marry his younger sister Octavia to make them actually brothers too. Antony's down for that, but Anabarbus confides in another servant that there's no way Antony's gonna get anything out of that relationship, not when he has Cleopatra to go back to. So Antony super promises Octavia that he'll be faithful to her, but one soothsayer later and he's already making plans to head back to Egypt after learning that Octavius is destined for a more glorious future than he is. And you know what? Props to him for not going the Macbeth route. I mean, I know it's less glorious or whatever to not murder your political opponents, but I'm not gonna fault this guy for wanting to spend the rest of his life with the woman he loves. Speaking of, Cleopatra learns Antony's officially married, again, and gets pretty salty, but feels better once she learns that she's much prettier than Octavia. Truly a victory for the forces of justice! So the triumvirate meets up with Pompey, the pirate guy they're gonna be fighting soon, and have a big old party on his boat, because trying to murder each other doesn't preclude having a grand old time. Lepidus gets stupid drunk and starts rambling about crocodiles or whatever, while Pompey's servant is like, you could totally kill them right now. And Pompey's like, oh, you didn't have to tell me, man. You could have just done it, and it would have been fine. Now it's too late. So, party ends, some fighting happens, some winning happens, and then some politics happen as Octavius gets paranoid about the other 2 legs of the triumvirate, bad-mouthing Antony and throwing Lepidus in prison for plotting against him. Antony, meanwhile, takes his ball and goes home to Cleopatra, crowning himself king of Egypt and his third of the empire with Cleopatra as his queen. He's also decided to fight the rest of Rome, I guess, for funsies? I don't know, it kind of feels like Octavius brought that on himself. Antony and Lepidus both felt like Octavius was taking more than his fair share of credit and winnings, and when he responded by throwing Lepidus in jail, I guess Antony decided to cut his losses and go home to his beautiful girlfriend. I mean, that's fair. Obviously Octavius upset, but really who's surprised? So Antony's hell-bent on fighting Octavius at sea, even though his navy is outclassed and his army is much better, but Cleopatra supports him in his endeavor with her own fleet of 60 ships. Several of the soldiers are predictably salty at having to take orders from Cleopatra, and when the time comes for battle, she actually pulls her fleet out of the fight early for no explained reason. And this is actually actually historically accurate, and we're not entirely sure why she did that. Anyway, Antony follows suit and they lose the battle, and he feels terrible because he thinks he's turned into a coward. He and Cleopatra make up though. I mean, this is pretty much their entire relationship. So Antony, kind of down because of his defeat, sends a message to Octavius asking to be allowed to stay in Egypt in peace, which Octavius refuses. The messenger also asks that Cleopatra be allowed to pass on Egypt to her children, which Octavius says he'll think about as long as she kicks Mark Antony out of Egypt and lets Octavius deal with him. So Cleopatra receives the news and tells the messenger that she'll agree to bow to Octavius, which again seems to be part of her textbook theatrical character. It's clear that Cleopatra has almost no respect for Caesar Octavius as a person, but if she thinks bowing and scraping to him will get her ahead in life, she's gonna do it. Unfortunately, poor timing is key, because at this point Antony bursts in and accuses her of betraying him. Cleopatra says she'd never do that, Antony's happy, and storms off to challenge Octavius to single combat, and his servant Enobarbus decides Antony's officially gone crazy. Octavius refuses the challenge, Antony gets pissed and decides to fight him anyway. The night before the battle, there are omens everywhere, and the soldiers believe this means that Antony's patron god Hercules has decided to abandon them in their hour of need. Antony doesn't care though, and gets all geared up to fight, whereupon he learns that Enobarbus has deserted him and gone to Octavius' side. Rather than being pissed, Antony's just kind of quietly sad, and orders his servants to deliver Enobarbus' stuff to him with a note of kind farewell. This makes Enobarbus so sad that he dies. So a whole lot of complicated battle stuff happens, but the short of it is that in the end the Egyptian fleet defects to Octavius' side, Antony blames Cleopatra, and Cleopatra comes up with the fantastic idea of making him believe she's dead. That way he'll remember how much he loves her, and everything will be okay again. Well, unfortunately, Antony's already pretty depressed, and this is kind of the icing on the cake. He takes the death of his Juliet about as well as Romeo did, and decides to fall on his sword and join her, with the added benefit of dying a hero rather than a coward, a lovesick idiot, or any of the other things he feels like he's become. However, he doesn't even manage to stab himself correctly, and just ends up mortally wounding himself. Truly a victory for the forces of justice! Like a hero. This is when he learns that Cleopatra's still alive, in what we in the writing biz like to call dramatic irony, and is carried to her, whereupon he dies in her arms. So Cleopatra is captured by Octavius' forces, but refuses to be made a mockery of or paraded through the streets like a trophy. Among her complaints is a bit of subtle humor. In the original production, she'd obviously been played by a young man, and one of Cleopatra's examples of the disgraceful treatment she'd be faced with is being played by a boy in stage productions. It's a funny time for humor, though, especially considering she resolves to kill herself rather than give Octavius the satisfaction of using her as a trophy. Using some asps she gets someone to smuggle in a basket of figs, Cleopatra commits a very dramatic suicide by snake. Octavius wonders if he handled the situation as well as he could have, then orders Cleopatra to be buried next to Mark Antony, which is sweet until you consider the fact that Egyptian funerary beliefs would have made it almost sacrilegious to bury a pharaoh in such an unfurnished tomb without even going through the embalming process. Nice going, Octavius. Shot through the heart, and you're to blame. You give love a bad name. I play my part, and you play your game. You give love a bad name. You give love a bad name.